Hi folks, today we're working on the concept of equity instead of equality. This can be a kind of a hard concept to get. It's become a buzzword. Everybody loves saying equity, and a lot of people don't actually know what it means. So we're going to get into it a little bit, and I know that I'm going to give you some stuff that can be pretty challenging. This is one of the more advanced concepts that there are, which is one of my pet peeves, is that people use it without actually knowing what they mean when they say it. There's some stuff that's a little bit easier to understand. So we have the little picture with the boxes, and right, so the little guys can see over the fence or not see over the fence, and everybody really likes that. One thing to recognize on that is that as we're thinking about equity is the notion that instead of focusing on the input, like how much we give people, how many boxes we give them, we want to focus on the outcome and say we want to give people enough so that they can reach the goal, and the goal is that everybody gets to see up and over the fence. So instead of being focused on input, we want to focus on the outcome. That's a good guiding principle. We're also going to talk a little bit about the cartoon that we worked with a while back, right? This was the racism cartoon in which we have the historical concept in which somebody's exploiting somebody else, and then they realize that it was a bad thing, and then they say, I'm so sorry, I won't do it again, and then this person is asking for a hand up. So we talked about this one a little bit before. And we have this panel, which is the outcome panel. And we said that if we were to ignore everything else that came before, if we could only see this panel, we would think that this guy is cheating, is asking for a handout, is asking for something he didn't deserve. So, right, undeserved entitlement, saying, oh, you should help me. That would make sense if this was all we could see. But as soon as we recognize all of the history that came before, and we say, oh, actually, it was the other guy that was cheating. It was this guy up at the top who had been cheating for a very long time. This guy's just asking to get caught up and saying, you need to fix what you made wrong. The other panel that I'm really interested in there is this panel here, where white guy on top recognizes that he's been doing something wrong. He's saying, I was so racist before, I won't do it again. And this is something that we kind of see right now where people say, it's like, oh, I see that that was bad back then. We're going to stop it. And from now on, we won't be doing that anymore. That from now on part is really important because people will say, well, from now on, nobody steals. I won't steal from you. You won't steal from me. Stealing is a bad thing. Nobody steals. I'm not going to give you your money back, though. I keep what I have. You keep what you have. I don't actually intend to make it right. I'm just going to say that from now on, I'll stop what I've been doing without repairing the problem that I created in the first place. And we understand from this cartoon that that's not a good idea. We won't play fair. We won't play equal until you give me my money back. And then after that, sure, we can talk about maybe how we're going to go from there on. But the first step has to be that you've got to fix what you put wrong in the first place. Otherwise, it's just lip service. Otherwise, you get to stay comfy while I get to stay squashed. That's really important when we're talking about equity, is that we've got to make it right before we move ahead. The concept of the catch-up cookie is really important here, right? So you have the two kids, the kid that you give a half cookie to and the kid that you give the full cookie to. And then you come back and you give the half cookie to the kid that you were owing, and the other kid's going to whine and complain and say, why are you giving them extra cookies? And remember, it's not an extra cookie. It's a catch-up cookie. It's the cookie that you were owing the other kid. It's not extra, it's just catch-up. These are things that are going to help us throughout today. We already have a recognition that we treat people differently and that that's okay and fair. It sounds really strange, though, because we've been taught that equality is the biggest principle, that we got to treat everybody equally, exactly the same, in order to be fair and just. Now, the thing is, that's something we like to say with our mouth, but we know that we don't actually carry out. And we actually have examples of how we treat people differently and that that's fair. So we have, for example, discount transit passes for seniors and students. And we understand that this is right, and there's a few reasons for it. One is that these are folks who need it more, right? They may not be able to get transportation otherwise. They may not be able to drive, so they absolutely need the transit passes more. We also know that they are on much more limited income. They don't have full-paying jobs, and so it's going to be harder for them to pay for a discount pass. So we understand as a society that these are folks that we need to give extra support to so that they can have that similar outcome, right? We already do this stuff pretty instinctually. So the question about dinner and who should pay for dinner, whether it should be the dad with the money or the daughter with the going to school, we a lot of times are pretty okay with the idea that this doesn't need to be paid equally 50-50. And I've heard a lot of different folks say, well, she should just pay the tip, he should pay the bill. But pretty much what we're trying to get at is that it's okay to treat people differently based on where they are, helping them to catch up. But we recognize that that discourse sounds really weird. So these are simpler examples. We're going to get more complicated as we go. You have the example of the Jimena, right? Jimena's story, who came out as bisexual, and she lost the funding from her father. So as we're thinking about how to make this better, we could ask, how much money will make this better? How much money will catch her up? Will $12,000 do it? And a lot of times my students say, oh, $12,000, that's enough money, we're even Steven, we're good. And what I ask them is, sure, that's great. What if I come to you today and say, I'm going to take away all of your funding for school, it's going to go away tomorrow, but don't sweat it, because I'll be back in 15 years and I'll pay you then. Would you like to take this offer? And at that point, people really say, no, I don't want that, really. Like, why? It's the same amount of money. It's the same $12,000. If it's a deal that you wouldn't be willing to take, then you understand inherently that it's not really a fair deal. So at that point, we could say, what would make it a fairer deal? We could say, well, you know, it may have taken her longer to graduate from school. It could be that it took her an extra few years to finish up. It could be that then she was delayed coming into the job market, and that then her resume isn't as advanced as her peers would be. If we start to consider all the lost opportunities that come from the timing of that money, then we recognize, oh, there's a lot more that's missing than just the $12K net. We could start to think about how it impacts somebody differently at different points of their lifetime to have stuff taken away. So how it's not the same going without food when you're 25, then when you're 15, then when you're 5, then when you're 5 months. At different points in your lifetime, that missing information or that missing money or whatever you're missing due to oppression is going to hit you differently. And when we try to make that up, it's going to be more expensive. So that's another one of the principles of equity, is that it's not just enough to give that half cookie. We may now even have to give an extra. We'd have to say, now we got to give a cookie and a half, because that hunger came at a very crucial time. We can't just be fine with the $12,000 that we're missing. We may need to add more in. We may need to add enough in so that you would willingly say, yeah, I'll take that deal. I'll go without the money for 15 years. If at the end of 50 years you pay me back for all of this. That's when we're getting a little bit closer to fairness. So again, we're starting with simple and we're going to make it more complicated. So now we're talking about issues, for example, of quotas, and saying some countries like Germany have said hire the female applicant whenever possible, or hire the person with a disability whenever possible when resumes are matched up. And so that's called preferential hiring. And we're thinking about how preferential treatment can be fair treatment. Just the same way that we've targeted folks, we've chosen a group and said, anybody with vulvas we're going to target for employment discrimination or sexual harassment. We're going to target them for that. Likewise, when we're looking for a solution, we're going to target the solution to the folks that have been hurt. We have to take into account history and structures and not play pretend as if we could just say, well, from now on, we're just going to move forward here in neutrality, in equality. We're just going to pretend that it's fine and from now on play fair or play equal. Like, no, we actually have to fix it first before we can do this play fair equality thing. And fix it might mean we're going to have to shove some folks, we're going to have to prop up a box under somebody for a while they catch up. So we started out with the concept, it sounds really pretty, now we start to look into the application and it gets more complicated. So if I were to say to you, Germany says preferential hiring, and you can say, yeah, I can see that, we're good. And then I could say, well, then what if the U.S. says preferential admissions process for college? And say, same SAT scores, same information, You should take the black applicant. Then people get a little bit more nervous and say, whoa, hang on, that sounds wrong. That sounds like discrimination. That sounds like reverse racism. And remember, we've already talked about how reverse racism doesn't work because of history and because of institutions and structures. There's no flipping it because there's an entire structure that supports one group but not the other group. Sorry, folks, technical difficulties. I'm back. We're talking about how reverse racism or reverse discrimination doesn't work specifically because of history. It's recognizing that there's an entire structure that helps one group but doesn't help the other group. So one of my students at some point said that he was on a plane and the airline pilot came on and talked about the flight, and it was a female pilot. And he recognized that he was getting a little nervous about it, and he was feeling kind of unsafe with a female pilot. And he knew that this was wrong in all kinds of ways. And thankfully, he was next to a friend, and he said, I'm having this weird nervous thing where I know it's wrong, but I know where it's coming from. Like, what's up? And his friend was very smart and said, hey, listen, if it's a female pilot, you are much safer in her hands than with a male pilot, because you know she had to work 3 times as hard to get through school. Is recognizing that we have an entire structure that's built to support one group and squish the other group down. So what we're trying to do with preferential treatment or targeted solutions is bring this group up, is recognizing that there is still an entire structure that benefits one group and not the other. It's when we try to play pretend that we're already equal that we have a problem. So we're trying specifically to recognize differences and catch people up after having squashed them for a while. So we have the case of Japanese reparations for the internment camps. So reparations were $25,000 a person for the survivors only, after 40 years. We start to think about what that actually adds up to and say, you know, accumulation is a problem. 40 years late, $25K is pretty low, because if we try to think about all the stuff that was lost, trying to make up for that, $25K doesn't come even close to that. Now then we get into the other question is, if we're saying that $25K 40 years later is too little too late, what are we going to do about slavery? How do we compensate people for stealing all of their money, all their labor, torturing them, breaking up families for decades and decades and decades and centuries? And then what do we say? Sorry, it's too much. We can't do much about it. We should just kind of forget it and move on. We gotta say, it's like, we can't move on until you pay me the money you stole from me. We can't really do this equal game or this fair game that you're proposing until I get the money that you took from me. And then after that, we can talk about where we go from there. But we gotta repair it first. If we think about the history of slavery in the States, there was the concept of 40 acres and a mule, in which at the end of slavery, there was talk of offering slaves a bit of reparations for the work that they'd put in and saying, we want to make that up by giving them 40 acres of land and a mule to work it with. Now, the thing is, that was a concept that was talked about that was actually never carried out. So when people say 40 acres and a mule, they're referring to the promise that never actually came through. Now, there were reparations paid in the States after slavery ended, and it was for the white folks. $300 a head for each of the slaves that were freed was actually paid out, millions and millions of dollars, to the slave owners to compensate them for the property that they lost. We know this is wrong. We know we've got to figure out a way to make it up. And the thing is, we can't just say, it's too bad, it's too late, we can't do anything about it, right? Because we do the comparison with Humana and say, it's been 15 years. I still want that money. In fact, I want the money and the stuff that I lost because of it. And I'm betting you would too. When it gets to be bigger and longer, we kind of want to throw our hands up and say, oh my God, it's too much. It can't be fixed. It can't be fixed. Oh well, we can never make it right. And it's true, we will never make it right. But we better start trying. We can't just say, it's too much, too hard. So sad. As we start to think about this notion of how to repair stuff, we could think of the McMaster University example and saying McMaster University figured out that they had a significant wage gap when it came to their female employees. Now, this isn't the remarkable part. A lot, if not most, corporations have a significant wage gap when it comes to gender. The remarkable part is that they went through a study to determine how much and that they actually paid it out. They actually went through and gave a raise to the women, saying, we're not giving you a raise because you're women. We are giving you a raise because you've been oppressed because you're women. So it's not a raise based on sex. It's a raise based on historical oppression. Is we're going to catch you up because we know there's been a problem. And as we catch you up, we can give you the money. Thing is, you want to measure again and see if that wage gap shows up again, because that happens. And say, oh, in 5 years we're going to measure and see if that wage gap is still there or if it's gone, and we're going to repair it again. And that's great, and that's wonderful going forward. But I got to think, if I'd been working at that university for 20 years and they only now finally figured out that they'd been cheating me out of my money, I'd want some back pay, and I bet you would too. Like, this is awesome and it's sweet. Thank you so much. How about the 20 years? Because I'm about to retire and my retirement fund's kind of short. So could you do a little back pay? These are things we want to consider. Now, the part that gets even trickier is when we think about intersectionality, is recognizing all of the identities that we got to work with and trying to figure out who's going to determine how much of a box, so how much of a boost we need to give people in order to compensate for the stuff we took away, who gets to determine who is in what group, who shouldn't be counted and who should. Should the box for gender be smaller than the box for queerness? And if so, then how do we account for the class box and the classism? It's like, how do we figure out which ones are pluses, which ones are minuses? And then it gets a lot trickier. But the principle of it is, we don't get to just give up and say, it's too hard, it's too bad, we can't fix it, let's just not even try. Because I need the money that I was shorted, and the folks that were shorted also need it too. So equity is a pretty out there concept. It's pretty radical. It's a targeted solution to a group that we've targeted for oppression. It's taking sides and having a non-neutral stance and saying, we're going to do something for this group and not this other group, because this group's been fine while this one's been squashed. So this is the answer to the question of, why is there a women's resource center but not a men's resource center? Why is it called women's studies and not men's studies? Why is it that we have scholarship for folks who are poor, but not for everybody? Why do we have scholarship for queer folks, but not straight folks? Is we're going to target them for a fix, because we've been targeting them for a hurt. In the words of the famous Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice, when she was asked, when will there be enough women in the court? Out of the 9 justices, how many need to be women before we're fine? And her response was, when there's 9. There were hundreds of years in which it was 9 men, and people weren't having a problem with it. We could just go ahead and say, let's make it 9. If the U.S. legislative system has had a proportion of about 85 to 15%, so 85% men, 15% women, for a very long time, could we think of, like, would it be fair then to go, hey, let's go 85-15 the other way? Let's make it 85% women and 15% men. Are we okay with that? And people will freak out and say, hey, that's not fair. It's like, but you were okay with it a minute ago. And that's the thing about the cookie, is that kid with that whole cookie, when he got that whole cookie, wasn't complaining. He was just kind of sitting still and not really making a fuss. If he'd been so concerned about fairness, he'd have been screaming at the top of his lungs saying, hey, it's not fair that she's getting a half cookie and I'm getting a full cookie. Everybody needs the same amount. When it was benefiting him, he stayed pretty quiet. So these are some pretty heavy and out there concepts. When somebody's talking to you about equity, you might want to ask them, what is it that you actually mean by that word?